As Hiawatha told the story of my falling into the gorge, the countenance of Ada Dehars began to change. A dim comprehension grew behind his expression. For the first time Ada Dehar spoke. His words were broken and halting. His face wore a puzzled look. He questioned Hiawatha regarding the location of the tree, for it had been a landmark thereabouts to those who hunted in the region, and apparently Ada Dehar had at least once stalked from its branches. When he began to grasp the fact that this tree had fallen with me in it into the gorge, that I had cut it off myself in order to communicate something important to the Mohawks, that I had survived the fall, and that the entire Mohawk nation now regarded me as a sacred being, Ada Dehar looked in my direction with new respect. In his broken manner of speaking, he questioned me about my tumble into the gorge and the details of my survival. He was amazed that anyone could have survived such a fall. His speech was not always easy to understand. He used a word that neither of us were familiar with, but that we gradually understood to be his term for justice. Apparently, even in the system of his confused and twisted values, Ada Dehar had some dim comprehension of right and wrong. At last we realized that he was speaking of the justice of my surviving such a fall, because of the strength and nobility of my intentions. He then gestured to himself and said plainly, and this time we understood, that in justice one with a heart as wretched as his own should not be permitted to live. He repented for the wickedness of his life, and begged that Hiawatha should kill him then and there. Hearing this request, I saw the flash of Hiawatha's long knife, as without hesitation he leapt at Ada Dehar, and answered him, not by killing him, but by swiftly cutting him free. During the stunned silence that followed, as the three of us sat together in equal freedom, the expressions that passed over the bewildered face of the astonished Ada Dehar were awesome to behold. Some minutes passed. There was a humor in the air, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of all three of us at one time or another having experienced a certain darkness of the soul. Picking up Ada Dehar's tomahawk from the ground where it had fallen in the struggle that now seemed so long ago, Hiawatha spoke of his own recent transformation from anger and hatred to his present commitment to aiding me in my mission. As Hiawatha told his story, he made it seem as if such a transformation was quite a natural thing, as if it were no surprising thing, really, that one who so recently had been full of the violent passions of the warrior would now, with equal passion, devote himself to this great and noble cause of peace. This was the first of many times that I heard Hiawatha speak in this way. It had its effect on Ada Dehar. In the months and years to come, I was to see it have its effect on others. There was naturalness not only in Hiawatha's person and in the form of his expression, but in the whole manner in which he conveyed his story. Ada Dehar was slowly nodding his head in agreement as Hiawatha handed his tomahawk back to him, saying, "We grant you your freedom, brother. Just assure us that you will not use this weapon against us or against any of the Iroquois people whom you will soon have reason to call your friends, as I now call you my friend." Ada Dehar reached for the weapon. "Friend," he said meaningfully, looking first at Hiawatha and then at the tomahawk, as for a moment the two of them held it together. "Friend," he repeated, "I could never use this weapon on a friend." When Ada Dehar spoke the word friend, he spoke it slowly, as if it caused pain, or stirred some ancient wound. Hiawatha withdrew his hand. In the broken speech of Ada Dehar that followed came the story of his childhood deformity, the ridicule of the other children, his subsequent plunge into evil and banishment from his people. Ada Dehar spoke of these things as though he were himself just remembering them for the first time after many long years. He ended his tale by gently lifting the tomahawk that Hiawatha had returned. Looking me and Hiawatha in the eye, he told us again, and with obvious sincerity, that he could never use such a weapon against friends. By now we knew the truth. Hiawatha and I were the first human friends the man had ever known. We stayed with Adadehar in his vale as spring warmed slowly into summer. I can recall the passage of no season before or since that I have more fully enjoyed. During the days we would hunt and fish, at times together, at other times alone. In the evening around the fire I would teach Hiawatha the songs that were the history of our people. As Hiawatha and I sang these songs together, songs of the bird tribes, songs born on the winds of eternal spirit, songs our ancestors had sung for tens of thousands of years before warrior values entered the hearts of our people, Adadehar was visibly changed. He began to sit up more straightly and to think more clearly. He felt, as we did, the healing presence of the winged ones. As Hiawatha and I sang often late into the night, we would sometimes see in the moonlight swirling luminous currents flowing from winged figures that appeared around Adadehar while he slept. Sometimes we would hear the gentle strains of a fine and subtle singing that seemed to direct the glowing swirls with melodies not unlike our own. We knew that the Great Spirit was healing Adadehar's body. Words and example had already healed his understanding. He did indeed, as it turned out, have an affinity for serpents, as one evening Hiawatha and I returned from a hunting excursion to discover his body virtually covered with writhing black snakes, no less than 4 of the friendly creatures entwined in his shoulder-length tangle of hair. It was an awesome sight to see them straighten their bodies in surprise at our approach, flickering their tongues and staring at us with tiny, intent eyes. Apparently the snakes had provided the lonely soul with his only source of companionship during his years of exile. When it was time for us to leave Adadehar to continue our journey to the summer encampment of the people of the Standing Stones, who by now had heard of our coming and were expecting us, Adadehar was a new man. Healed and strengthened, looking younger and stronger, he walked with us to the edge of the vale. Before we took our leave, he held our hands together in his own and shook them, saying, "I will go back to my own people, to the Onondaga, who once drove me out. I will tell them what has occurred here and speak to them of what you have shown me. I will tell them of this great light, of this wisdom you teach. I will tell them that 2 sacred beings will come among them in the not-too-distant future, speaking of peace and singing the songs and words of the winged power tribes that all revere. When you come, I assure you, they will welcome you and listen. You are my friends, you 2. You are my first friends. I thank you." We left Adadehar, hiking leisurely through a forest now sprouting the full growth of summer, speaking with one another as we walked of all that we had seen, of Adadehar, and especially of his people, the Onondaga, the fierce and stubborn people of the hills. We were not to see Adadehar again for nearly 3 years. By the time we were at last to find ourselves among his people, we would have already secured the agreement of 2 other tribes besides the Mohawk, the Oneidas and the Chayungas. Though many tales could be told of what transpired during our journeys as we lived and worked among the people of the Standing Stones and the people of the swamps, it was the conversion of Adadehar's people, the Onondagas, that was both our most difficult and most significant encounter among the 5 nations. Despite the growing strength of our reputation and the welcome that was extended to us due to Adadehar's testimony, the fiercely independent Onondaga proved to be the most headstrong of all the tribes, the most resistant to our teachings. They were ever polite in their listening, but being rugged people of the hills, they were slow to let mere words change the traditions of recent generations. Gradually, between Hiawatha's tale of my fall into the gorge and Adadehar's inspired and much repeated reference to an older tradition that harkened back 100 generations, we helped the Onondagas see their more recent traditions in perspective. Eventually, they came over to our way of thinking.